World leaders have arrived in southern Italy ahead of the 50th G7 Leaders Summit. The meeting brings together leaders of the world's 7 largest advanced economies to tackle some of the biggest issues. Top of the agenda this year will be the wars in Gaza and Ukraine. Our correspondent Mark Lowen is there for us. Mark.
Martin, thank you very much indeed. Yes, hello and welcome to southern Italy, the region of Puglia, which has been elevated for a couple of days to the centre of diplomacy, host to the G7, the meeting of the world's most industrialised nations, and the president this year is Italy. Now, the meeting is actually happening about 80 kilometres from where I'm speaking to you now. We're in the media area in Bari, which is the capital of Puglia, but the leaders have a much more glamorous location. They are gathering at a gorgeous, sumptuous resort called Borgo Ignazia, which has played host to the wedding of Justin Timberlake and Jessica Biel. It was a place of where Madonna used to holiday, and apparently the late Sean Connery rather liked holidaying there as well. And it is the place where leaders will tackle a huge array of pressing issues for the world, from the climate crisis, to Africa, to migration, to Ukraine, to artificial intelligence, a session that will be personally attended by Pope Francis on Friday, the first time that a pope will attend the G7. Now, in the last half hour or so, the leaders have gathered for their traditional family photo, as one big happy family, of course. The permanent members of the G7 posing under an olive tree, the leaders of the US, France, Germany, Japan, Canada, Britain, Italy, and of course the presidents of the European Commission and European Council as well, who are joining them. And the striking thing really is, you look at these pictures there, are that so many of those smiling leaders are facing massive political problems back home. Rishi Sunak, of course, leader of the UK, could be on his way out, languishing in the opinion polls before an upcoming election on the 4th of July. Joe Biden facing electoral woes potentially against Donald Trump in November. There was that crushing electoral defeat for President Macron in France after the European elections on Sunday, which saw him resoundingly defeated by the far right at National Rally and prompting parliamentary elections there. In Germany, Olaf Scholz was beaten into 3rd place in those EU elections, the worst ever result for him. Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau behind in the opinion polls before next year's election too. And then the one stable place is the one that perhaps you might not expect to be so stable, the country known for its political volatility that's known almost 70 governments since the Second World War, Italy. Giorgia Meloni boasting that she goes into this G7 as the strongest government of all. And in the last half hour or so, she has addressed the world leaders at the start of this summit.
Italy decided to host the Leaders' Summit in the region of Puglia. This was not a coincidence. We did this because Puglia is a region of southern Italy, and the message we want to launch is a G7 which, under Italian presidency, wishes to strengthen its dialogue with the nations of the global south. And we did this because this area has historically been a bridge between East and West.
Giorgia Meloni basking in the glorious Italian sunshine, but also, of course, in that victory in the EU elections on Sunday that saw a comprehensive win for her Brothers of Italy party, increasing their share of the vote, in fact, from national elections a couple of years ago. So she is the only Western European leader to have emerged strengthened from the EU elections, and so that is very much behind the confidence that is being exuded by Italy's Prime Minister. Well, looming large over this summit is, of course, Ukraine, and the leaders are expected to greenlight a proposal which would see the interest on frozen Russian assets in the West, which total around about $300 billion, being used as a loan for Ukraine. So the interest on those assets would equal about $50 billion, which could provide much needed funds to war-weary and cash-starved Ukraine. The loan coming against the frozen Russian assets, which would be used as collateral. So we're expecting that will be approved at a G7 level, and that will be a hugely important deliverable, perhaps one of the few actual concrete deliverables we will expect from this G7. This will all be, of course, very closely watched in Kiev and Moscow for the reaction. A little earlier, I spoke to our Russia editor Steve Rosenberg in Russia and Jean McKenzie in Kiev.
Well, President Zelensky is not treating this as a done deal just yet. Just in the last few minutes, he posted on his Telegram channel that he was waiting for important decisions to take place later today. But I think there is a sense of optimism because he also said that he was forever grateful to Ukraine's partners for believing in Ukraine and believing in Ukraine's victory. And this is a substantial pot of money we're talking about, this $50 billion. If you put that into context, the most recent package, the aid package that the US Congress passed, was just over $60 billion. Now, the idea is that Ukraine would be able to spend this money to relieve some of the financial pressures that it has been under. What could it spend this money on? Well, one expert I was speaking to was saying that the best thing that Ukraine could spend this money on would be defence. Might sound obvious, but its own defence industry. So particularly sort of joint defence production capabilities with other countries. This idea being that Ukraine over time really wants to reduce its dependence on its Western allies for defence. I was speaking to somebody just a little earlier who was campaigning for this to happen, and they were saying, look, what they were actually hoping for was that Ukraine was going to get access to possibly this whole pot of money, not just the interest payments or even a slightly bigger chunk of it, but they were accepting that, look, this is a really good first step. Even though they did make this point that when it comes to Western support for Ukraine, it has always come in these rather incremental steps.
Yeah. I mean, this plan has come in different iterations, actually. There was an original plan to actually seize and liquidate those frozen Russian assets, which was fiercely opposed by some quarters like Christine Lagarde, President of the European Central Bank, that had said that could set a dangerous precedent in international financial law. And so now the idea is that the interest could be used for the loan instead. Steve, what's the reaction, if any, likely to be in Russia? I mean, I was reading that there was a warning from some Kremlin officials that Russia also could seize Western assets, the remaining Western assets in Russia.
Well, in fact, not so long ago, President Putin signed a decree that would make it possible for Russia to seize the assets of American individuals and companies in Russia. Not clear how that's going to work. But certainly the expected green light that you talk about, Mark, has Russia seeing red. In recent weeks, Russian officials have spoken about this idea of taking the interest from its frozen assets as theft. So I think if this goes ahead, the reaction will be pretty negative from here. It's quite interesting, actually, the way the Russian media and Russian officials are looking at the G7 meeting, because on the one hand, there's a lot of bluster. They're very dismissive. They're pointing at the figures around the table and talking about how weak they are domestically. The British Prime Minister, the leaders of France and Germany after their drubbing in the European elections. On the other hand, clearly there is concern here that this summit could lead to a tightening of international sanctions against Russia, removing some of the loopholes to make it just that bit harder for Russia to finance and sustain the war effort.
Steve Rosenberg, our Russia editor in Moscow, and Jean McKenzie in Kiev. And actually, Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, is one of the invited leaders to this summit, because the G7 is often accused of being an exclusive club. And, there are external invitees every year to try to reach a broader international consensus. This year, leaders from North Africa, from the Middle East, from South America coming here. And also, of course, the president of Ukraine, who has said that he will be pushing for a quicker fighter jet training for Ukrainian pilots by others, and more long-range weapons as well. And already President Biden is saying that he will sign a long-term security deal with Ukraine that could potentially outlive a Donald Trump presidency, maybe. Let's see whether that is going to be the case. So plenty to discuss and plenty to mull over with our diplomatic correspondent, James Landale, who is here with me now. James, nice to have you here. A lot on this agenda, not least, of course, Ukraine, but also Africa, with Italy trying to push for energy and infrastructure projects in Africa to try to stem migration. And the Middle East, of course, the other war that's hanging over this summit. What hope is there that the G7 can add diplomatic clout to the calls for a ceasefire, where so many other forums the calls are falling on deaf ears?
Well, what's been fascinating is actually the G7 gave its support to the latest sort of Biden peace plan, as we're calling it, in a statement actually last week, along with lots of other international institutions and organisations, to try and give some momentum to it. In other words, so that the leaders said, we can't wait until this summit. We have to demonstrate our support before that. So they've issued that statement. They'll say something similar here today. The problem is they're not going to solve this problem right now. But what I think they will try to do is once again just put as much pressure as they possibly can on the Israeli government and Hamas to shift their position so that they can reach some kind of agreement. This will just be another ratchet up of the international pressure. Thus far, that international pressure has largely fallen on deaf ears. But I think what the Americans will want to do is to sort of show the rest of the world that it's not just them that's trying to put pressure on the Israelis, others will too.
I mean, if you are Benjamin Netanyahu, you're looking at this club of leaders who are facing a myriad of political woes back home, and you might be thinking, well, we might have a Donald Trump White House in November, which will be much more amenable to us. We might have Emmanuel Macron fatally weakened by these parliamentary elections, so that might actually, embolden Israel politically at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, that is the fundamental problem and question mark that's hanging over the whole of this summit at the moment is, as you say, the electoral fragility of quite a few of the leaders who are here. But that said, as you said earlier, the G7 isn't completely, futile. A lot of other world leaders are here too. You've got leaders from India, you've got leaders from the Gulf, you've got leaders from South America, who all come here because they know that these 7 countries plus the EU have a combined economic weight and clout that can make differences. So, for example, on Ukraine, this idea of using Russian assets, this idea of expanding existing sanctions, ultimately, that is a great test of the combined economic weight of the G7 and the EU together. And it's going to be fascinating to see how far they go down that route, to see what impact they can have. Because we're at that stage now where we're beginning to see the limits of the G7's physical power. I don't think we're quite there yet, but we will see a bit of it in the next couple of days.
And I know you'll be watching the mood music as well for possible the last international hurrah of Rishi Sunak, the British leader, before the 4th of July.
I think we could say with confidence it's probably the last time he'll be on the world stage during the campaign. It was very noticeable, actually, when we were all watching the leaders come in and be welcomed by Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister. They get on really well, Mr. Sunak, and there was a lot of physical chemistry going on there. If you look at the body language, was slightly more stiff with the other leaders. So look, he has an ally here, and they share similar instincts on a lot of the issues about migration and things like that. But as you say, certainly the last time we'll see him out on the world stage during the campaign.
James Landell, our diplomatic correspondent, thanks very much indeed. Yeah, so possibly the last international summit for Rishi Sunak. Let's see whether that happens on the 4th of July, but also the domestic political situation. So many of these G7 countries that I think will be front and centre of this summit here in Puglia. We'll continue to watch all the twists and turns, but for now I'll hand you back to Martine in London.
Mark, thank you very much. Mark Lowen.